Good morning and welcome to our final seminar series session for this semester and for the year, of course. This series, of course, is brought to you by Insight and APSAT in a partnership. And we'll begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet today and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. And we'd also like to extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us today. At a time when established truths are questioned, when feelings trump facts, when the role of the expert no longer commands respect, how should we approach the evidence-based underpinning of the work of the alcohol and drug services? Perhaps the narrative is the answer, engaging a sometimes hostile public. Today we have Dr. Jeremy Hayllar. Jeremy is the Clinical Director of Metro North Mental Health and Alcohol and Drug Services, and he's presenting Alt-Truth and the Post-Truth World. Where does alcohol and drug evidence fit in Trump's universe? Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks very much, Rod. When I decided to try and put this talk together, I thought I'd find a bit more out there to help. So if you feel that I haven't met my brief, I would be the first to admit that I haven't. So I put some other things in as well. We've got a few disclosures. I try not to get bought off by Big Pharma, but it's very hard, as you know. Here's what we're going to talk about. Just a bit on overdose deaths from the Pennington report, which has got some quite local information, which is good. Big vested interests. We're accustomed to talking about big tobacco, big alcohol, big soft drinks. You know, it just goes on, I'm afraid, in this corporatized world. An interesting thought, post-truth. Then some highlights from APSAT. It was a really good conference this year, I think, although someone said that was a contradiction in terms. I think that's unfair. So I've put together one or two slides. I took images and I've tried to attribute them correctly, but I may have messed up. And then finally, I thought I'd just mention the codeine audit that staff at Melaleuca helped to put together. Rod's given you that. The Oxford Dictionaries fired the shot heard around the infosphere when it announced its word of the year 2016, post-truth. Now I've put the underline in, relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So this, I think, quite well sums up the challenge that we all face, that you go into a meeting with someone who has firm views, you put the information on the table, and it's all rebutted by how that person feels. Feelings may not be supported by any evidence. One flaw, however, in this definition is how do we define objective facts? And it may be seen as a fault or a reflection of modern values taught in universities, that we have now learned that facts are social constructs. They're not actually defined outside the human domain. So facts are open to interpretation, they evolve and they change. So if we think of theories of the universe, before Copernicus, the Catholic Church held as a fact that the sun and all the planets revolved around the Earth. Then we learnt that actually the facts were different. And in many ways, you can see that facts have evolved to fit a growing body of scientific evidence. So objective facts, I'm afraid, is still a bit of a loaded term. So deaths from pharmaceutical opioids. We can see here Queensland in maroon is kind of equal second at the moment. This is up to 2015. It's notable that Tasmania is very, very low. They have quite a tight control with their prescription monitoring real time, which is supposedly coming to the rest of Australia next year, but we've heard that before, haven't we? And clearly on its own, it's insufficient. However, as part of a range of responses, it may be very useful. Just to highlight where Queensland, unfortunately, is standing out a bit, overdose deaths per 100,000. Remember in the US, where we've got this opioid epidemic declared by their illustrious president, though I think $60,000 was allocated to address this epidemic. Probably nothing to do with the fact that he'd received $240,000 from Big Pharma for his pack. So, you know, money doesn't play a part, of course, in such decisions. In Queensland, the rates of overdose deaths are up to 20 per 100,000. Here we're talking about 3 per 100,000. So there's almost an order of magnitude difference. Nevertheless, Queensland is top equal with WA in terms of overdose deaths from prescription opioids per 100,000 of population. And it's gone up significantly. Here we've got a breakdown of Greater Brisbane, and you can see that there are areas where the proportion of deaths is greater than 10 per 100,000. So that's getting up towards the US. And I think, if my geography serves me correctly, that's Bribie. So this is sort of Caboolture and inland. And that's one of the areas that stands out. Is that Straddie? Yeah, so we know that Straddie attracts people who may be trying to escape. So this is one of those photos, and it shows quite nicely the way that opioid use, prescription opioid use particularly, has been evolving over the years. So at the bottom here we've got morphine, and really oxycodone, as we would all kind of recognise in our guts, has taken over from morphine as the major prescription opioid. We can see that fentanyl, which was pethidine, which was this tiny little line here, has really disappeared as it's been taken out of the doctor's bag, and it's very rarely used in obstetrics these days. Looking at some others, so methadone, interesting that there was a sort of peak here in 2002, and although the numbers in methadone treatment have gone up very significantly, particularly in Queensland where they've more than doubled since around 2000, methadone deaths are down, suggesting that the clinic is exercising reasonable risk management. The buprenorphine figures here, usually it's in conjunction with other substances. Hydromorphone, that's sort of a relative newcomer on the scene. You've heard of Jurnista. In Australia, because we're strong and tough, there are 64 milligram Jurnista tablets nowhere else in the world, as far as I know. And they are 5 times more potent than morphine. So that's a 300 milligram morphine tablet in equivalent. Do we really need such heavy doses? This illustrates the changing nature of opioid deaths. Here we have heroin, which is, you know, becoming a bit out of fashion, really. And here we have the pharmaceutical opioids, which are really taking over to constitute about 70% of the total deaths. So it's quite an interesting transition. And what you can see is really the heroin has sort of grumbled along. We reached a peak in 2000. We heard at APSAD there was a strong move to get a medically supervised injection facility opened in Melbourne because of that high rate of heroin overdose deaths. And then with this rapid decline here, it suddenly melted away, and the political and the public pressure was lost. We heard recently that there has been approval for an injection supervised facility in Melbourne again. So things go round and round, don't they? This is only up until 2013. So heroin deaths grumble along, but the prescription opioid deaths are growing larger and larger. And this kind of reflects the same. Here we have 54% of opioid-related deaths in 2009, no recorded IDU history, and chronic pain, 52%. So this is the population we're increasingly trying to manage, and some of them are not very keen to come into opioid treatment for obvious reasons. Just another slide from the Pennington report, which you can download for free. It's a very interesting resource. This is looking at fentanyl, pethidine and tramadol, and we really do seem to be the fentanyl capital of Australia, with a dramatic increase in deaths. And you might say, why have they chosen 2005? Because in 2006, fentanyl was no longer confined to palliative care. It was available for persistent pain, which was a huge boost to company profits, no doubt. But unfortunately, we've heard of all the ways in which patches are misused. Right, does anyone recognise these two photographs? Here we're getting down to it. I've obviously covered up the captions so that we can have some audience participation. So this on the left was, I think, 2008 or so, or 9, and then this was in 2017. And of course, if we then, yeah, there we are. And clearly there are far more people present in 2017, and you would all agree with that alternative fact, as it was classed. Now, when that is getting airwave time and it's kind of accepted, then we've got something to worry about, hasn't it? Because no way can you say that the numbers attending the Trump inauguration were greater from that photograph than the Obama inauguration. And apparently it was something to do with the grass which was covered up to protect it that meant the Trump numbers were greater. Nonsense, of course. So isn't it interesting? There is a PostTruth Initiative at the University of Sydney, which strives to analyse and comment on fake news, alternative facts, lies, bullshit and propaganda, with the aim to understand them and to advise on how the truth might survive in this climate. Again, it does ask the question, what is truth? Said Pilate, and would not stay for an answer, which was the subject of a previous talk. And when you've done 26 in a row, you kind of do start repeating yourself, so I do apologise. I've got this sweet little book. It's very small. Harry Frankfurt, philosopher on bullshit. He decided the subject of bullshit, which he likened to humbug, which is rather an American word, I think, had not been sufficiently studied. So he set out to write 65 pages on bullshit. And this is one of his points. Bullshit is not simply lying, it's worse. To lie, you first have to know the truth, or think you know the truth, and we've discussed what truth is. And you have to care about the truth, whatever the truth may be thought to be at that time, enough to cover it up. To that extent, at least, the liar still maintains some relationship to the truth. The bullshitter, by contrast, doesn't care about truth at all. They just want you to believe what they say. What could be simpler? What they tell you could even be true, for all they know. It doesn't matter, so long as you buy it. So it's quite a nice illustration. Right, NASA spokesperson forced to deny that the space agency has put child sex slaves on Mars. This was in The Independent, for heaven's sake. So, being a dutiful fact checker, I went to the NASA website looking for their press releases, and there is no such thing. So this is a fake story about a fake story. And we do kind of get ourselves very almost lost down rabbit holes here, don't we? A recent conversation just a couple of days ago looking at young people and how they read fake news suggested that only a third of them were able to try and differentiate between the real and the fake, and 2/3 didn't really seem to think it mattered very much. So that's a bit alarming. Now, this is one of the most famous bits of fake news that have come in recent times. This is a bus from which country? Can anyone guess? Of course you can guess. It's the Brexit bus. And we know this absolute nonsense that captured the public imagination, didn't it? It was a very effective way of ignoring all the facts and the data which the Remain campaign put forward and just addressing some sentiments. Everyone knows the NHS is on its knees. I've got personal experience of that in recent times, as some of you may know. And this idea that, one, you can regain control. Think of a previous Prime Minister saying, we will control who comes to our country, crosses our borders. These ideas, memes, if you like, are trying to capture a political vacuum and really take over public perceptions. And it was incredibly successful, as everyone would know. Anyone recognise the gentleman on the left? Jim, I'll send you these slides happily, because this is a potential Prime Minister of the UK if Theresa should fall over and break her leg. What's his name? Yes, it's our Boris, isn't it? Used to be Mayor of London. Harold Evans, who was editor of the Sunday Times, said, I would not trust Boris with my wife or my wallet, which says it all, really. And on the right there, I don't need to introduce him. So trolls or trolls, and I thank Mark for this idea to juxtapose the two images. We are approaching Christmas, so I hope you'll forgive some levity in this talk. So now to the serious business, alcohol harm reduction. This is the message I want you to take away, corporate capture of a key concept. What this paper from 2014 is saying, and fancy Colin Drummond being seen in the same headline as John Strang and Kypros Kypri, who's from Australia, because Colin Drummond's sort of from the other side, almost a private practitioner who got into deep trouble with some rapid opioid deaths and some rehab fiascos.
Ron Colin.
Yes. Excellent. Thanks very much for putting me right again, Mark.
And Colin Drummond, he's the other side of the river from John Strang.
Okay.
Doesn't mean it's unusual to see them on the same.
Okay, so it's not the Colin Drummond I was thinking of. Thank you very much, Mark. So in the alcohol policy field, harm reduction really has served corporate, not public health interests. National partnerships with big alcohol do not deliver. And I think this is a very important message, because big alcohol harm reduction messages actually entail harm promotion. That's a concept that Alex Wodak kind of introduced, harm maximization. Public health served by reducing overall consumption is achieved by controls on price, outlet density and opening times, none of which corporate capture allows to be discussed. They'd much rather focus on the individual choices that heavy drinkers make. So corporate capture manages access to information, so they're very cagey about their data, about sales and so forth. They generate doubt. They like to say that, you know, a bit of grog may be health promoting, so don't miss out on that opportunity. And that's taking a leaf from big tobacco, who were described in one famous book, The Merchants of Doubt. Just introducing enough uncertainty to make those established truths a bit shaky. They misrepresent the evidence, so-called bending science, downplaying unfavourable evidence and pushing evidence that supports their own case, which is obviously about sales of alcohol. And they use this somewhat vague term, harm reduction, to exploit the libertarian aspect. Have we heard of cutting red tape in this country? That's a similar argument. We ignore the fact that red tape produces safe food, it produces air quality, it produces decent education for children to go on to be employees of big companies. Criticising the nanny state, you know, we need to be helicoptered through our existence. So these are very powerful arguments for those who favour throwing away gun control or clearing land to their own taste. It's a slippery slope, I'm afraid. It is impossible, say Kipri and colleagues, to reconcile the corporate economic model, extending their markets by advertising and promotion, and influencing policy, which they try to do at the highest level, with true harm reduction. So harm reduction is rather different between illicits and alcohol, where you've got this huge legal commercial interests informing promotion and sales. If a policy or a program reduces harm or problems, then it's harm reduction. That's the simple definition they come up with, and we should use that criteria to analyse the approaches taken by big alcohol, and they fall well short. So HR must not be defined in a way that serves the corporate interests. This is a great image from recent cyclone Irma. A Florida man who suggested shooting guns at Hurricane Irma, not out of stress and boredom, has found that his idea has captured people's imagination with over 46,000 posts. So it's trying to suggest that if you fired bullets at the cyclone, you could make it turn around and go away. I mean, it shows what's happening out there, doesn't it? Another paper on vested interests, addiction research, and this shows how the tentacles of big alcohol have really infiltrated to the highest levels of international government discussions and decisions. So the UN, in its non-communicable diseases policy, did exclude big tobacco, but there was a very heavy big alcohol presence. And no doubt those politicians and others present were sampling the wares of big alcohol. Big alcohol participate in the World Economic Forum, and they focus on partnerships, which is a way to protect their interests, of course. So did you know they sponsored Gleneagles in Scotland, the G8 in 2005? The transition of EU leadership in Poland was bankrolled by big alcohol. In University College Dublin, they're sponsoring a health project about risks for young people, big sporting events. In the UK, the National Organisation on Fetal Alcohol Syndrome is actually sponsored by the alcohol industry, paying no regard to intoxicated young women who may become pregnant through unwise decision-making in a state of intoxication. That's fine, that's business as usual as far as they're concerned. So there's a huge developing world presence, just like we've seen big tobacco refocus on developing world markets to boost their sales. and even persuade abstainers that they need to participate. So, of course, by participating in partnerships with government, they look like good corporate citizens. They emphasise self-regulation. They suggest targeting heavy drinkers rather than the population as a whole. And rather than the drink, the alcohol, which does it, the person who's made the bad decision. Education, very hard to demonstrate that delivers results. So they push that, of course. They minimise the harms, focus on the benefits, as we've said. The moderate drinker is key, and the benefits to the moderate drinker are push. They even want to recruit abstainers in emerging markets. So this is a big alcohol-sponsored website, DrinkWise, and I've been through it. It's full of pictures of alcoholic beverages and people having a good time. So what a mixed message to be sending, and we should be very suspicious. I've ordered this publication they talk about here, just to say that How to Drink Properly campaign was a winner in 2015 in a national media competition. So what a bizarre arrangement that these guys who are supposedly sending safe messages promoting drinking should win that prize. More glasses and people enjoying themselves. Expressions of drunkenness, 400 rabbits, what a bizarre. So I asked for a copy of this, they said they'd send it. They didn't have an online version, which was odd, and it hasn't arrived yet, I'm afraid. So this was a headline in the paper recently. Alcohol warning systems do very little to change behaviour. So the companies would probably be willing to let them go, wouldn't they? Another example of their fundamental interest to protect the value of their shares for shareholders. FAIR is a much more independent and enlightened organisation, and we should be getting our health messages from them. Now we'll go to tobacco. Some of you have maybe seen Philip Morris International decided recently to promote this website, supposedly independent, funded by Philip Morris to the tune of almost $100 million per annum for the next 10 years. So when you first look at it, and this is the new director who used to work for the WHO in tobacco control, his name's Derek Yak, and he's a public health physician. And you can hear him talking on the website. Initially, some of their material looks quite good. So global epidemic, 1 death every 6 seconds, 7.2 million deaths annually. You know, those are reasonably good facts to promote. And then you read what Simon Chapman has to say. And some may think Simon Chapman is a little bit partisan, extreme. He was one of the drivers behind plain packaging. So I think he's a good guy myself. So this is in the British Medical Journal just recently. Philip Morris International, Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, 80 million per annum for 12 years. Now, we have to see that in the context of sales of 26.7 billion and a spend on advertising 7 billion per annum. Tobacco is their key product. Why would they fight plain packaging if they wanted to reduce the incidence of smoking-related harms? So anyone accepting money from the sale of tobacco is going to meet unavoidable ethical problems, and it's something we should not do. And there have been intermittent scandals with famous universities trying to take money from big tobacco and then having to give it back because the association is such a poor message to be sending. So their goal is to help eliminate smoking worldwide. As Simon Chapman points out, there aren't any benchmarks for this modest task, and it actually joins a long and deceptive failed history of tobacco harm reduction, each breathlessly supported by experts. Think of asbestos filters. Can you believe it that was a move for a while to make tobacco safer, put a cancer-causing agent into the tobacco filter? Lights and slims, that huge deception practiced on women particularly. And now vaporizers helping to blur that distinction between smoking and non-smoking. And I'm afraid I even heard this at APSAD, vaping perhaps possibly protecting children against future smoking rather than introducing them to tobacco and nicotine in the future. So it's quite an interesting challenge. on the origins of environmental bullshit. Yes, as you can see, that's DDT being sprayed around slum areas in the US a few years ago before we realised that it might not be terribly health-giving. I had to put in this comment. The suggestion that the Brexit vote and the election of Trump were prime cases of post-truth politics angered one audience member who said that the panellists were liberals who had been in the minority on both arguments, had lost, and now were claiming the wins were the result of public ignorance fed by untruth. This was nothing more than virtue signalling, he said. In other words, is this just about the liberals complaining about Hillary Clinton's deplorables? And we have to be mindful of that an inclusive and equitable society is much better able to fight off that sort of argument than a society where the 1% accelerate away from the rest. So this is, I think, my final comment about post-truth. We must form a real popular front against the faux populism of Trump and the neo-fundamentalism of Mike Pence that is likely to follow Trump's fall from power. So that's kind of anticipating what might happen, and who knows whether it will or not. We must, in other words, become post-truth. So that's one of the post-truth guys at the University of Sydney. It's a really good website with some great talks which are feature in the conversation these days. So now I'll turn to APSAD, and this was a talk by Professor Harrison G. Pope Jr. from Harvard. He's a professor of psychiatry, and when I first saw him I was a little concerned because he seemed quite senior in years, and he was talking about anabolic androgenic steroids, and he gave a really excellent talk. Highlighted here was Mr. Universe 1947, and now Mr. Universe 2017. Look at the difference. What is that difference due to? It's steroids. So this guy did his best in the gym, and that's what he came up with. This guy did his best with the drugs, and that's what he came up with. And this has actually changed our views of manhood and masculinity in a deleterious way. And in the UK, this is called Action Man. I think it's G.I. Joe in Australia. So he's become much more muscular. And if you look at the small version of G.I. Joe, he's sort of turned into a bit of a monster, really, hasn't he? And unfortunately, this is reflecting and driving public perceptions of what it is to be a man. So men in the audience, better get down to the gym and find your veterinary supplies if you're going to make it in life. Because this is, we had a registrar who'd written a piece that was published on muscleorexia. So this is the really big, strong guy looking in the mirror and feeling that they're just this puny wretch and they've got to keep working at it. So he set the scene extremely well for us, and I must say it's the most memorable talk at APSAD that I went to. So I rewrote his slide here just because I was getting to such a big document. What is the risk of adverse effects? He made the point that about 30% of those who begin with casual use of anabolics become dependent, which is probably higher than any other substance and really quite alarming. One of the reasons is that they're having central effects as well as peripheral effects, and people know that if they stop the medication, then all this wonderful muscle they're so fond of, which isn't enough, will melt away, quite apart from the effect on their testes. So he gave us 4 key areas that we should be worried about: the cardiovascular system, premature atherosclerosis, persistent hypogonadism. So the teaching used to be that things recovered, but now there's concerns that actually they don't if you've been using for long enough and high enough dosing. Psychiatric disorders, and I've put in highlights there neurotoxicity, because this is quite an interesting area. So he had a series of cognitive studies on steroid users and suggested quite strongly that over time they had measurable increasing cognitive deficits. He points out that this widespread use of anabolic steroids only started in the 80s and 90s, and so we may be about to see a tsunami of users developing a dementia as a result of anabolic steroid use. ADFs, abuse deterrent formulations. Are they effective in reducing opioid-related harm? So this was a talk by Bryony Lawrence. Well, they may be effective in reducing specific harmful practices, for example, buprenorphine, naloxone, and I don't know what that one is, sorry. However, her data show quite nicely that even though Targin was being promoted, there are other agents which can take over. So they don't likely result in a net overall opioid utilization fall in use. So they're not really going to impact very heavily. So for the individual patient, there may be benefits overall, though there's probably not a great deal. And it's a bit like the real-time prescribing. It may be part of a comprehensive program where no single intervention produces all the results that you want. Now, this was an interesting, very small study using cold pressor testing. So that's when you get your patient to stick their hand in a bucket of iced water. They had a special bath for doing it that apparently could also be used for cocktails and things, but we won't go into that. And I think they just had about 10 patients, and they had patients on methadone and patients on buprenorphine. And what they did is either increase their dose of methadone by 30%, or their dose of buprenorphine by 30%, or add oxycodone, a roughly equivalent dose. And what's really interesting is how there was no single pattern of response. So a couple of people were able to increase their pain tolerance very dramatically after an increase in their methadone dose, but most of them, it didn't really change their pain tolerance. The test is how long you can leave your hand in the bucket of ice water before it's so painful you have to remove it. Now, that is a fairly artificial way of measuring pain perception, isn't it? They don't want to do anything too destructive of tissues because that would be destructive. So this is a kind of model that has been used, and it's been discussed how representative it is of actual pain. And similarly, the buprenorphine, what was surprising here was a couple of people did really nicely with the extra oxycodone, whereas most of them didn't do very well with the extra buprenorphine. So what a lot there is left to understand about pain and acute pain management, particularly in those with a long-term opioid dependence. So this was really asking more questions than it answered. Now, you may not be aware, there is a second buprenorphine depot that's got the very glamorous name of CAM2038 that's in the pipeline. And the advantage it has over the opposition product from Indivior is it doesn't need refrigeration. So Nick Linzeris presented a study of patient satisfaction and efficacy of the depot product, and they had interestingly 2 products, one that lasted a week, one that lasted a month, with 3 or 4 different doses of each. Which contrasts with the Indivior product, which has 1 duration, a month, 4 weeks, and 2 strengths, 100 and 300 milligrams. So what's very dramatic here is how people, the very large majority, more than supported same-sex marriage, for example, thought that the depot was so much better than the daily product. So we need to watch this space, and really could turn opioid treatment upside down, couldn't it? Because if all you need to do is get a monthly injection to be stable and well, then that's going to be a real paradigm shift for us all. This is a talk that was on the subject of medicinal marijuana, medicinal cannabis. And there's been some suggestion from a paper in the US that in states with medicinal and non-criminalized cannabis use, there are lower rates of opioid overdose, suggesting that somehow cannabis might provide some protection by offsetting some of the opioid requirement. So this was from the POINT study, which looked at opioids being prescribed and dispensed from pharmacies, and they asked people about their cannabis use. So there were about 1,500 patients in the POINT studies, and almost 10% had a history of regular cannabis use, and almost 80% of them said cannabis had no effect on the usual opioid medications. So that causes us to just think a little bit further before we push too rapidly with cannabis for pain purposes, which is the major indication from the USA. We in Australia don't seem to think it helps with opioid reductions. So the final bit of my talk is looking at patients on opioid treatment who came with codeine as their primary drug of choice. And we found 35 patients. So about 10%, and that actually means it's the second most common drug of choice in Melaleuca if you divide up all the prescription opioids into individual opioids. 32 of those patients were on Suboxone and 3 were on methadone. And the 3 on methadone had actually come from other clinics. So as has been suggested from other studies, really it's a very common route for people to go from the codeine to buprenorphine rather than to methadone. The mean age was 43 years, which is roughly the same, slightly older than the NOPSAD data. Interestingly though, 2/3 were female, whereas NOPSAD 2/3 are male. So we've got a female preponderance. The mean dose of codeine, and this is relying on patient reports, so we have to take that with a pinch of salt, was 550 milligrams. So that's an oral morphine equivalent of about 82.5 milligrams. So for anyone who isn't aware, codeine is a prodrug which is metabolized in the liver to morphine, the active product, and other breakdown products of codeine. And therefore, when someone's using codeine, they're actually benefiting from the effects of morphine. 10% of the population or so do not have the 2D6 enzyme system which makes that conversion happen. So for them, codeine really has no effect as a pain reliever. And there are also some ultra-rapid metabolizers who have several copies of the necessary enzyme that converts codeine to morphine, who produce much more morphine than normal. And there have been several reported deaths from overdose. One in a breastfeeding mother who was using codeine in moderate doses only while she was breastfeeding her newborn, who became increasingly comatose, and it wasn't picked up, and the poor thing died at about day 11. And also in children after tonsillectomy, when codeine is used as the analgesic product. So the move by the feds to mean that codeine is only available on prescription from codeine products from the 1st of February, we think is a very positive one. And there are certainly services, for example, in Canada, it's strongly recommended that codeine is not used for the under 12s because of this unpredictability. If you're giving a medication which is incredibly potent for some and has no effect for others, significant groups, then it's really not a very good choice to be making. So we looked at this patient group on the average highest dose of buprenorphine naloxone they achieved, 24 milligrams, which is considerably higher than one would convert the oral morphine equivalent into. And the current mean dose was 20 milligrams. So some were coming down, but most were still being held at high doses, and a significant proportion were on 32. The mean duration of opioid treatment, 7 years. As we know, this is a chronic disorder. We're trying to prepare adequately for what may be between 100 and 200,000 patients who've been getting by with their over-the-counter codeine products. We're trying to prepare for what may happen on or around the 1st of February. This doesn't go away with a week's withdrawal medications in most cases, does it? So we really need to think longer term and how it's going to be managed. So just some other findings. 88% past or current tobacco use. And there's an interesting interaction between nicotine and codeine, which may boost codeine levels in the brain only. The 2D6 cerebri may be induced by nicotine that I found in a paper. One thing I wanted to look at, and I'll probably have to go back and do this a bit further, because a paper from New South Wales looking at 7-day and 28-day buprenorphine naloxone dosing in codeine users did suggest there was a relationship between the codeine dose and the dose of Suboxone that they ended up taking. In this case, and often it's years after they've come into treatment, there was no relationship at all. So we would kind of differ from this finding by Nielsen et al., where they found this significant relationship. And I think what it really reflects is that these patients have complex problems. Nearly half had a pain history, as you might expect if they were using codeine. About 1 in 5 had serious complications by using these combined analgesias, so the ibuprofen and the paracetamol, leading to complications, particularly the ibuprofen and its effects on the gut with peptic ulcer disease, perforated ulcers, anemia, bleeding, all those things which we see unfortunately rather regularly. 1 in 5 had other major medical conditions. I was surprised by 1 in 5 having, there was also 1 in 5 with major mental health diagnoses, bipolar and so forth. And a total of 70% or so had been at some stage in receipt of antidepressants. So I don't count depression in that 1 in 5 with a major mental health diagnosis, because it's so common in this patient group. And surprisingly, I thought 12% had a history of seizures, not from tramadol toxicity as one might suppose. Other substance use, we've said the tobacco use was 88%. So surprisingly, some patients had a remote history of heroin use, and then through whatever reason they'd relapsed to opioid use through over-the-counter codeine. And I can think of one patient who, in his youth, he'd dabble with heroin for a year or two in his late teens. He'd then got clean. Then 25 years later, he was cleaning out his aunt's flat. She had died from breast cancer, and on her bedside table was a pack of slow-release morphine. So he didn't even think, he just slipped them into his pocket and started using them, and found that they'd reignited that spark that opioids had left behind. And then for 12 months, he carried on using by reverting to the over-the-counter codeine products before he came into treatment. He's still at Melaleuca Clinic, and that's now about 10 years ago that he came into treatment. So it really is something that I think the politicians find a struggle to get their heads around, how hard this is as a disorder to leave behind, and that simple path of abstinence is really so hard to achieve for many of our patients, particularly when they've got other health issues. So quite a lot of cannabis use, over a third, alcohol, amphetamines, benzos, and polysubstances. So really quite a complex group of patients. This is not simply someone who's been playing around with codeine products, finds themselves taking too much and keeps going because they can't stop. There are usually other factors informing that behaviour, which we clearly have to address. I thought I'd try and put a final example. The most anticipated masterpiece awaits an exclusive audience that desires unrivaled prestige living. Now, I don't know whether we call that out-truth, bullshit, or hyperbole, but that's the realty crap that you see just down the road from where I live. Oh, God. Thanks very much. Any questions or anything? So the question was, are modern politicians even worse than their predecessors? I believe the real change has been how the bullshit is received, and that has kind of fueled greater and greater outlandish comments. So whatever her name is, Sally Ann Conway, Trump's spokesperson, discussing those crowds, you can see it on YouTube. She gets pushed and pushed by the other journo, and she complains that he's really being aggressive, and all he's trying to do is get her to agree that the crowd numbers are different, and for her this is an alternative truth. Now, one would think that 20 years ago that would have sort of been laughed out of court. What's happened now is that people seem to accept that, and they don't really worry about it. So I think it's mainly the audience that has changed. Not all the audience, of course. The enlightened attendees at this seminar would never dream of accepting alternate truth. However, as Hillary put her foot in it with the deplorables, there is a significant group of disenfranchised, mainly white, mainly middle-aged men who've seen their living standards deteriorate over the last 30 years, who are getting into substances, who are suiciding and overdosing at increased rates such that the overall mortality rates in the US have started falling off, which is remarkable. So that is the group that have been left behind, in a sense, by loss of industry to China, as Mr. Trump keeps telling us, and so deindustrialization, the post-industrial world. They don't have prospects, and I think they are voting with their feet for some sort of recognition. Now, whether Trump's going to fix any of that seems extremely unlikely. At least he's addressed them and got their votes on board.